The bustling marketplace was a symphony of life, with vibrant colors, enticing aromas, and the constant chatter of bargaining voices. Stalls lined the narrow streets, displaying everything from ripe fruits and fragrant spices to handcrafted trinkets. Amid this lively chaos, a young boy named Ethan stood beside his mother's modest fruit cart, his small hands deftly arranging apples and oranges into neat piles. Ethan was only 10 years old, but his bright eyes and quick smile belied a maturity beyond his years. His clothes were simple, a faded shirt and worn-out sandals, but his demeanor radiated a quiet pride. He worked tirelessly to help his mother, Helen, who had raised him alone after his father's passing. Life had never been easy for them, but Ethan's cheerful spirit was a light in the shadow of their struggles. Across the street, the sleek hum of an expensive car broke through the marketplace's noise. A shiny black sedan rolled to a stop, drawing curious glances from the vendors and shoppers. Out stepped a woman dressed in a designer outfit, her high heels clicking against the uneven pavement. Her sunglasses reflected the sunlight, and her perfume lingered in the air like a statement of wealth. The woman, Mrs. Elizabeth Rahman, was a regular visitor to the market, though not for its modest offerings. She often came to order exotic goods from select vendors, always maintaining an air of superiority. As she scanned the crowd, her gaze landed on Helen's fruit cart and the little boy working diligently beside her. Elizabeth's lips curled into a smirk. "How quaint," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Children working in the streets while their mothers sell scraps. How utterly pedestrian. Unaware of the scrutiny, Ethan continued his work, wiping the fruit clean with a cloth and flashing a smile at a customer who stopped to buy a few apples. His mother glanced at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. But Elizabeth's presence didn't go unnoticed for long. Her elegant figure and polished demeanor stood out like a sore thumb in the humble market. A few vendors whispered among themselves, their expressions wary. Elizabeth had a reputation for her biting remarks, and today would be no exception. As Elizabeth adjusted her sunglasses and prepared to approach Helen's stall, her heels clicked louder, drawing attention. Little did anyone know, the words she was about to speak would set off a chain of events that would leave everyone in shock, including herself. What happens when arrogance meets humility? Would you stand up for someone being belittled, or would you stay silent? This story is about to take a turn no one in the marketplace could have anticipated. Elizabeth Rahman strode through the marketplace, her designer heels clicking against the uneven pavement. The sun glinted off her oversized sunglasses as she glanced around, her expression a mix of disinterest and disdain. To her, the vibrant market was nothing more than a chaotic jumble of stalls, a place she only visited out of necessity. Her sharp eyes landed on Helen's fruit cart, and she paused. The modest display of apples and oranges seemed to amuse her. Her gaze then shifted to Ethan, who was carefully stacking fruits into neat piles. Elizabeth's lips curved into a smirk as she approached, her presence drawing the attention of nearby vendors. "Excuse me," Elizabeth said, her voice dripping with condescension as she stopped in front of the cart. "Are you seriously making a child work in these conditions?" She gestured toward Ethan without looking at him, as though he were an object rather than a person. Helen looked up, startled by the interruption. "He's helping me," she said softly, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her headscarf. "We do this together." "Together?" Elizabeth's laugh was sharp, cutting through the hum of the marketplace. How noble, teaching him to scrape by selling these scraps. She waved her manicured hand dismissively at the neatly arranged fruits. Ethan's smile faltered, but he stayed quiet, his small hands gripping the edge of the cart. He had seen this kind of person before. People who looked down on his family because they didn't have the luxury of comfort. His mother had always taught him to stay respectful, no matter what. "I'm teaching my son the value of hard work," Helen said, her voice steady despite the insult. "There's no shame in earning an honest living." Elizabeth tilted her head, her sunglasses sliding down slightly to reveal cold, scrutinizing eyes. Oh, I'm sure he'll learn plenty. Like how to haggle over pennies or live paycheck to paycheck. Quite the life lessons. A murmur ran through the crowd as a few vendors and customers stopped to watch. Some whispered among themselves, their faces showing a mix of disapproval and unease. Others averted their gazes, not wanting to get involved. The marketplace, usually lively and welcoming, felt heavy with tension. Ethan couldn't hold back anymore. "My mother works harder than anyone," he said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "She doesn't deserve to be talked to like that." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "Oh, how charming," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "A child standing up for his mother. Tell me, do you think your little speeches will change anything? You'll still be here next week selling your sad little fruits." The boy's cheeks flushed, but he held his ground. Helen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, silently urging him to stay calm. "We may not have much," Helen said, her voice stronger now, "but we have dignity, something money can't buy." The words hung in the air, drawing a sharp intake of breath from the onlookers. Elizabeth's smirk faltered for a moment before she recovered, her arrogance shining through. "Dignity?" she scoffed. "Dignity doesn't pay the bills." "Neither does cruelty," a voice from the crowd called out, breaking the spell. The onlookers turned to see a middle-aged man standing with his arms crossed, his expression stern. "You've made your point, lady. Now why don't you move along?" Elizabeth bristled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I don't need lectures from the likes of you," she snapped before turning back to Helen. "Just remember, you can't change where you come from. People like you and your son. This is your place." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but Helen stepped forward, her chin held high. "And people like you," she said evenly, "are the ones who remind us why humility matters." The tension in the crowd reached its peak, the silence thick as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Elizabeth scoffed one last time before turning on her heel, her heels clicking loudly as she stalked away. The crowd began to disperse, but the air was still charged with the weight of the confrontation. Little did Elizabeth know, her words would soon come back to haunt her in a way she could never have imagined. The marketplace buzzed with hushed murmurs after Elizabeth's departure, her cutting remarks still hanging in the air. Helen returned to arranging her fruit, her hands steady despite the sting of the woman's words. Ethan stood beside her, his small frame stiff with lingering anger. He had seen people look down on his family before, but something about Elizabeth's arrogance had struck a deeper chord. "Don't let her get to you," Helen said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. "People like her don't understand what it means to work hard for a living." Ethan nodded, though his clenched fists betrayed the frustration he couldn't fully suppress. "She shouldn't talk to you like that, Mama," he said, his voice firm. "She doesn't even know us." Unbeknownst to them, a man in a neatly pressed suit had been watching the entire exchange from a nearby stall. His sharp eyes had followed every word, and his expression grew more serious as he observed Elizabeth's behavior. The man, Mr. Jonathan Blake, was a quiet but influential figure who often visited the market for its sense of community, a stark contrast to the cold corporate world he usually inhabited. As Elizabeth moved toward a stall selling imported goods, her confidence still radiating, Karim stepped forward. His deliberate strides carried an air of authority, and the vendors parted slightly as he approached. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. Elizabeth turned, her sunglasses sliding slightly down her nose. She looked him up and down, noting his tailored suit and polished demeanor. "Yes? Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. Karim's eyes flicked briefly to the fruit cart across the street before returning to Elizabeth. "I couldn't help but notice the way you spoke to that vendor and her son. Don't you think you were out of line?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "Out of line? I was just stating the obvious. People like them should know their place." Karim's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "And what place is that exactly?" he asked, his tone sharper now. Struggling to make an honest living? Teaching a child to work hard and value family? That's a place we should all respect. Several onlookers paused to listen, their interest piqued by the confrontation. Elizabeth bristled under their gazes, her discomfort evident as she adjusted her sunglasses. "I don't see why this concerns you," she snapped. "I was merely speaking the truth. Karim stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, though the weight of his words carried through the quieting crowd. "The truth," he said, "is that people like you are blinded by your privilege. You don't see the strength in those you dismiss. But let me tell you something. You're wrong about that boy." Elizabeth blinked, her expression faltering. "What are you talking about?" Karim turned his gaze toward Ethan, who was still by the cart, unaware of the growing drama. "That boy has more potential than you can imagine," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And one day, people like you will wish they'd treated him better." The crowd murmured in agreement, the tide of opinion shifting against Elizabeth. She shifted uncomfortably, her once confident demeanor cracking under the pressure. "You can't seriously believe that," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "He's just a street vendor's child." Karim's eyes narrowed. "And yet, he has something money can't buy: resilience, character, and heart. Those things matter more than you'll ever know." For the first time, Elizabeth seemed genuinely unsure of herself. The crowd's disapproving stares weighed on her, and the whispers of judgment grew louder. She looked around, suddenly aware of how isolated she had become. "Think carefully about how you treat people," Karim said, his tone final. "Because the world has a way of humbling those who forget the value of kindness." With that, he walked away, leaving Elizabeth standing alone, her confidence shaken. She cast one last glance at Helen's fruit cart before hastily retreating to her car. But the unease lingered, a seed of doubt planted in her mind. The marketplace slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the tension remained palpable. Across the street, Karim approached Helen and Ethan, offering a kind smile. "You handled that with grace," he said to Helen. "And your son, he has a bright future ahead." Helen looked up, her surprise evident. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Karim nodded, his eyes lingering on Ethan. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. You're destined for bigger things." As he walked away, Helen and Ethan exchanged a look, their hearts warmed by the unexpected kindness. Neither of them knew just how true Karim's words would prove to be. Later that afternoon, the marketplace bustled on, but whispers of the confrontation between Elizabeth and Helen still floated among the vendors and customers. Elizabeth, now seated in her sleek car parked nearby, tapped her manicured nails against the steering wheel, her irritation barely contained. Despite her earlier confidence, Karim's words had unsettled her. That boy has more potential than you can imagine. What did he mean by that? And why did it bother her so much? As she debated whether to leave or confront Karim again, her driver knocked on the window. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "there's something you might want to see." "What is it now?" Elizabeth huffed, rolling down the window. The driver pointed toward the center of the marketplace, where a small crowd had gathered. Curious, and still feeling the sting of her earlier humiliation, Elizabeth stepped out of the car and walked toward the commotion, her heels clicking loudly. As she approached, the crowd parted slightly, revealing Ethan standing beside a man dressed in an elegant suit. Elizabeth's breath hitched. She recognized the man instantly. It was none other than William Harris, a renowned entrepreneur whose name graced the headlines regularly. His business ventures had earned him both wealth and respect, and he was known for his charitable efforts to uplift underprivileged communities. William was speaking to Ethan, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "You've done well, my boy," he said, his voice warm and filled with pride. Your mother has raised you to be strong and kind. That's the legacy your father would have wanted. Elizabeth froze, her confusion growing. Legacy? Father? The pieces began to click together in her mind, and her face paled as realization dawned. This boy is William Harris's nephew. Someone in the crowd, unable to contain their excitement, whispered loudly, "That's the late Mr. Robert Harris's son, the one who started the charity for street vendors." Elizabeth's heart sank further. She remembered the name well. Robert Harris had been a beloved figure in the city, known for his humility and dedication to helping others. His tragic passing years ago had left a void in the community, but his family had carried on his mission. And now, standing before her, was his son, Ethan, whom she had mocked and belittled only hours earlier. William turned to face the crowd, his gaze landing on Elizabeth. His eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing her from earlier. "I heard about what happened today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's disappointing to see how some people treat others based on appearances." Elizabeth's cheeks burned as the crowd turned to look at her, their expressions a mix of disapproval and curiosity. I didn't know who he was," she stammered, her usual confidence crumbling. "And that," William replied, his tone sharp, "is exactly the problem. Kindness and respect shouldn't depend on someone's status or identity." The crowd murmured in agreement, their judgment evident. Elizabeth's shoulders slumped, her arrogance replaced with regret. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her earlier cruelty now felt like a glaring stain she couldn't erase. Meanwhile, Ethan stood quietly beside his uncle, his small frame radiating a quiet strength. He didn't gloat or sneer. Instead, he simply looked at Elizabeth with the same composure his mother had taught him. Helen, standing nearby, placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her pride evident. The crowd began to applaud softly, a show of support for the boy and his family. Elizabeth, overwhelmed and humbled, stepped back, her head lowered in shame. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly small. The marketplace had settled into a hushed calm, but the weight of the moment lingered. Elizabeth stood on the outskirts of the crowd, her head lowered, the earlier confidence and arrogance stripped away. William's words echoed in her mind. Kindness and respect shouldn't depend on someone's status or identity. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Then, summoning her courage, she stepped forward, her heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that now seemed less imposing. The crowd watched as she approached Helen and Ethan, her expression a mixture of shame and resolve. "I owe you both an apology," Elizabeth said, her voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. She removed her sunglasses, meeting Helen's gaze directly. "I spoke to you in a way that was cruel and unjust. I had no right to judge you or your son." Helen looked at her for a moment, her expression unreadable, before she nodded gently. "It's not me you need to apologize to," she said, glancing at Ethan. Elizabeth turned to the boy, who stood quietly beside his mother, his small hands clasped in front of him. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm truly sorry. You showed strength and dignity today, qualities I didn't recognize because I was too blinded by my own ignorance." Ethan looked up at her, his hazel eyes steady. For a moment, he said nothing, then spoke with a wisdom far beyond his years. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said softly. "What matters is what you do to make things right." Elizabeth felt a lump rise in her throat at the boy's words. "You're right," she said, her voice cracking. "I want to do better." William, standing nearby, stepped forward. "If you're sincere, Mrs. Rahman, there are ways to help," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Helen and her son don't need charity. They need opportunities. Maybe you can start there." Elizabeth nodded quickly, her earlier arrogance replaced with determination. "I'll do whatever I can," she said. Turning to Helen, she added, "I'd like to help expand your business. Set up a proper shop so you and Ethan can have more security. And if there's anything else you need, I'm here." Helen's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded. "That would mean a lot," she said. "But more than anything, I hope this moment teaches all of us to treat each other with respect, no matter where we come from." The crowd began to disperse, many of them whispering about the transformation they had just witnessed. Elizabeth stood with Helen and Ethan a little longer, discussing plans for the future. As she left the market that day, she felt lighter, as if a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. Helen looked down at her son, her heart swelling with pride. "You handled yourself well today," she said, ruffling his hair. Ethan smiled, his face glowing with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had stood tall. "You always say dignity matters more than anything, Mama," he said. "Now I know why." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the marketplace buzzed back to life, its vibrant energy renewed. The day had been a lesson in humility, compassion, and the power of standing up for what's right. And for everyone who had witnessed it, the message was clear. Kindness and respect can change even the most hardened hearts. Thank you for watching this powerful story of humility and transformation. Elizabeth's journey reminds us that arrogance can blind us to the value of others, but it's never too late to learn and make amends. Helen and Ethan showed us the true strength of dignity, kindness, and resilience in the face of adversity. Have you ever witnessed a moment where arrogance was humbled, or someone learned a life-changing lesson about respect and kindness? Share your experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories. Your words might inspire someone else to act with compassion. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and family. By spreading stories like these, we can create a ripple effect of kindness and understanding in the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another impactful story. Remember, kindness and respect don't cost anything, but they can change everything. Thank you for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next story. Stay humble, stay kind, and take care.